The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening. This is Lauren Bloom. I'm a Vice President of the Navy Mutual Aid Association and in charge of the Education Department. And this evening we'll be discussing fundamentals of long-term care. More specifically, we'll be talking about what long-term care is, how to assess your long-term care needs, how to pay to get them met, and where you can go to get more information. First of all, it's important to talk about what long-term care is and is not. I think there's a tendency for people when they think about long-term care to immediately start thinking about nursing homes and hospitals, the kind of places that you go for residential care. Now, that's one way to think about it, but it's certainly not all of what long-term care is all about. And it's also not necessarily medical care. Now, there are chronic conditions that require long-term care that also involve medical care. But the fact that you are getting medical care doesn't mean you necessarily need long-term care. And long-term care isn't necessarily medical care so much as it is custodial care. So if you have a chronic illness like emphysema, for example, you may need both the doctor's care and also someone to help you with your daily needs. But the long-term care and the medical are not the same. Now, another point that I think is important to mention is that long-term care and long-term care insurance often get confused in people's minds when they think about long-term care. We're going to cover both of them tonight, but before we can really talk about long-term care insurance, we need to talk about what long-term care is and is not. Long-term care is assistance with basic self-care. And typically, when talking about long-term care, we talk about the activities of daily living. You'll see a list of them here on the screen. These are the basic things that people need to do to care for themselves. And the usual rule of thumb, when you're talking about eligibility for long-term care payouts, for benefits, is whether or not an individual is able to accomplish all of these activities of daily living without help. Eating on assisted walking, transferring from a bed to a chair, for instance. And ordinarily, if you're not able to perform two or more of these activities of daily living, or ADLs, as the people who work in this field typically call them, for some extended period of time, often it's 30 to 90 days, then the notion is that you will need long-term care. In other words, help doing these things. Now, it's worth noting that the kind of help involved can depend on the individual. And some insurance programs, some other benefit plans will only pay for hands-on assistance with these activities of daily living, whereas others will cover what's also called standby, which is to say, for example, maybe someone who needs help transferring occasionally from a chair to a bed, but much of the time is able to do so alone. If somebody has to be there to stand by and watch, then that's also a form of long-term care. Now, long-term care isn't just limited to help with activities of daily living. There are also what are referred to as the instrumental activities of daily living, such as housework or taking medicine or going shopping or pet care, using the telephone, or responding to something like an emergency alert. Those things are the activities that people engage in, and they are essential to living an independent life, which is to say you're able to live alone, you're able to care for yourself. Now, not all insurers, in fact, many of them, don't consider these instrumental activities of daily living when they're determining whether someone is or isn't eligible to receive long-term care benefits. They typically refer back to those activities of daily living on the previous slide. But it's worth noting that all of these things are things that need to happen in daily life. And so if you or someone you care about isn't able to do these things for an extended period of time, then they will need long-term care. It just may not be the kind of long-term care that an insurer or a benefit plan would cover. Now, are you going to need long-term care at some point in your life? Well, that depends on a number of factors. According to many experts, approximately 70% of those people who are currently turning 65 are going to need long-term care at some point in their lives. But whether you will or not depends on a number of factors. And of course, we're projecting the future, so it's not always going to be certain whether you will need it or not. Certainly one thing you want to think about is your age. The older you are, the more likely it is that you will need long-term care, but age is not necessarily determinative. Right now, 40 to 45% of long-term care recipients in the United States are actually between the ages of 18 to 64. These are people who, for whatever reason, an illness, a disability, an accident, are unable to perform the activities of daily living or the instrumental activities of daily living, and so they need long-term care. So yes, your age is a factor, but don't just assume that because you are under the age of 65 that you won't need long-term care between now and when you turn that age. Gender is another factor. Typically, women in the United States live about 5 years longer than men do. And so because their lives are longer, they have more time in which to need long-term care. And so the odds are good that those women are more likely to need long-term care than men would. Your health status. How healthy are you? How healthy are you likely to be in the future? Do you currently have any disabilities that limit your ability to perform the activities of daily living? Is that disability likely to get worse? Do you know you have a minor problem now that could get more severe over time? Something else you want to consider. And it's not just your health that you ought to look to. If you have records available, it's worth considering your family health history. If, for example, you know that one of your parents or a grandparent was diagnosed with something that was disabling at some point in their lives, and we'll talk about some of the chronic conditions that can create those disabilities later, and you are likely to inherit that condition, then that will increase the likelihood that at some point you will need long-term care. You also want to at least give some thought to your living arrangements. People who are single, who live by themselves, who don't have a strong personal support network among friends and family, are more likely to need paid long-term care than people who have that network in place and can rely, to some extent at least, on family or friends or community to help them fulfill the activities of daily living. Now, if you are going to need long-term care, how long are you likely to need it? This table gives you some idea of what's typical in terms of the percentage of people who use various types of care on a long-term basis. Some people use only unpaid care, some people use paid care, and some people use some combination thereof. At home, it typically runs from 1 to 2 years, and as you'll see, anywhere from 42 to 65% of people will use it at some point in their lives. People who live in an outside facility, whether it's an assisted living, a nursing facility, or any other in-facility care, typically will go less than 1 year, and the percentage of people varies from 13 to 37%. But when you start talking about all long-term care services, the average number of years is about 3, and 69% of people use long-term care currently. And we believe that that number is likely to increase as baby boomers continue to age. So there will be more long-term care recipients going forward than there are right now. It's also worth pointing out that long-term care isn't necessarily something you need only once. Depending on your life, depending on your medical history, depending on your medical needs and what happens to you in the course of your lifetime, you may need long-term care episodically throughout your life. And you may need different kinds and services of care at different stages of your life or in different stages of a progressive illness. So if you're going to get long-term care, who can provide it? Most typically, people who need long-term care tend to rely on unpaid caregivers, a family member or a friend who looks after them on an informal basis. And in fact, 75% of unpaid caregivers are women looking after parents, spouses, sometimes children, other relatives or friends. And they do this out of the goodness of their hearts, and they don't get paid for it. But there are also professional providers of long-term care. Some of them are skilled nurses. There are home care health aides. Therapists or other caregivers, professional companions can provide long-term care services because long-term care comprises so many different elements. There are adult day services where people who need long-term care can go during the day to interact with other people, be helped by professional people who run the facility, and then there are other outside facilities that we'll talk about as well. Often a blended approach can be the best so that you end up with some help from an unpaid caregiver, some help from an outside facility perhaps, or a professional who comes into the home. And the combination is enough to give the person who needs long-term care the support that's going to be best for them. Now, many people who receive long-term care really prefer to do so in their own home. It can be very traumatic for people to have to leave their homes and move into a residential facility. And so this can be a great option depending on your circumstances and what you're able to work out. So, for instance, you want to think about things like the condition of your home. Is it livable? Do you need to build it out in some way? Do you have stairs, for instance, that need to be covered by a ramp? Or put in a bathroom so that you can live all in one level? What kind of caregiver services are available to you in home? And that's going to depend on a lot of different factors. Price, your need, what's available in your community. And for that matter, what's available in your community support network. You may find, for instance, that there are community not-for-profits, houses of worship sometimes provide these things, family, friends. And also there can be tax and legal questions associated with building out your home to provide you with a venue for long-term care. So that's something you're going to want to think about and talk to your legal and tax advisor before you make a decision about whether to try to get long-term care at home. And it's not only your home that can provide a venue for long-term care. You can also consider living with family or friends. And sometimes, for example, with adult daycare facilities, you can use outside facilities to supplement home care. So you can do adult daycare, you can provide respite care so that family members who are caring for you in the home are given a break. Lots of different things that you can do. And then, of course, there are also facilities that provide long-term care, the adult day that we've already talked about, and various residential facilities that provide different kinds and levels of care. So they range everywhere from continuing care retirement communities, which are basically apartment units around things like social activities and meals, all the way up to full hospital care and ultimately into hospice. These facilities are available, and it's worth noting that 40% of those people who are reaching age 65 will enter a nursing home at some point before they pass away. And 20% of them will stay there for 5 or more years. So even though you may start out fairly independent with a little bit of informal care in your home, at some point the odds are pretty good that you may find yourself needing residential care on a fairly high level. So what is it going to cost? Well, as with so many things involving long-term care, that depends on a lot of things. Informal care from a family member or friend tends to be the least expensive, but it may not be enough to meet your needs over time. And it's worth pointing out that informal care comes often with hidden costs. Very often, informal caregivers will end up giving up or losing their own jobs to care for someone. And also that means that they then not only lose salary, but can also lose their own benefits. So that's a factor to consider as you are thinking about who will provide you with long-term care throughout your life. It's also worth noting that where you get it makes a difference. Being at home may not be the least expensive way to get the long-term care that you need. Because, for example, if you are someone who needs regular care 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's going to go out at an hourly rate that's basically pretty expensive. And depending on the level of expertise and specialization of your caregiver, a paid companion will cost less than a skilled nurse or a physical therapist, but you have to factor those costs in. It's also worth noting that the time of day you get may make a difference. If you're asking for care on nights or weekends or holidays, it may end up costing more than it would if you simply had someone look in on you during the day. So what will it cost? Well, again, it depends. The numbers that you see here are averages. As you can imagine, there are regional costs differences, just as you might expect, so that large urban areas like the Northeast or the California coast tend to be more expensive than some other regions. But these are national averages, and as you see, home care runs about $500 a day. Nursing home care is actually less expensive. Assisted living is less than that, and adult daycare tends to be the cheapest. But it's worth pointing out that even in these facilities, there are often incidental charges that don't show up in the original contract. So as you're thinking about what kind of services to go for, you need to recognize that you may end up paying more than you expect to as a result of those incidental charges. And so, for example, if you end up in a nursing home for 2.5 years, on average nationwide, that's going to cost about $200,000. And in those urban areas, it will cost more. And so for that 20% we talked about a moment ago who go into a nursing home for 5 years or more, you could be talking an expense of $500,000 to cover your long-term care. And it's probably worth mentioning that, again, as the baby boom ages, it is likely to become more expensive because the demand for long-term care will be greater. So with that, how do you pay for it? I've got a list of options here, and you'll notice that health care insurance is not on the list. The reason for that is that health care insurance typically does not pay for long-term care. Even if you've got great health insurance, it may pay for your hospital, for your doctors, for your medications, for physical therapy, all those things. But in terms of the custodial care, the day-to-day assistance with the activities of daily living, probably your health insurance won't pay for it. And so long-term care is something that you pay for in a supplemental way. Now, a lot of people think that they'll be able to have Medicare or Medicaid pay for their long-term care, but again, that may not be true. Medicare, for example, doesn't typically pay for custodial care. It will pay for 100 days of skilled nursing care in a facility or at home, typically after a hospital stay. But there are copays, and it may not be available to you depending on the kind of care you need. Medicaid actually pays for 2/3 of the long-term care in this country, but to get Medicaid, you have to pass a fairly stringent financial needs test, which means you have to have very limited resources, and again, there may be a copay. So you may not be eligible for Medicaid unless you're at an income level where you can get those benefits. And a lot of the folks listening tonight probably are not. At that point, it's a matter of looking at other ways to pay for it. Now, one possibility is a reverse mortgage, where you stay in your home but take a mortgage against the cash value of your house. On the FHA, Fannie Mae, various private companies offer these. Annuities can be very helpful. You invest a certain amount of money. The growth on the investment is tax deferred. Great way to build up money to pay for long-term care in the future. Life insurance with a long-term care option, whole life insurance, many policies, Navy Mutual's Permanent Plus is one, but there are others as well, offer the option of taking a portion of the death benefit and paying it out early if you can demonstrate a need to pay for long-term care. And then, of course, there's also long-term care insurance, and we'll talk about that in an instant, which is a kind of insurance that's specifically designed to pay for long-term care. Now, with reverse mortgages, annuities, life insurance, and long-term care insurance, you're talking about a contractual relationship between you and the entity that sells you this product. And the terms of those contracts can vary tremendously depending on whom you're buying it from and what the product is. So you need to read them carefully. And of course, there's also the other ways to pay for things through other personal wealth that you might have. If you have a pension, if you have a 401k, if you have other savings, that can be great, but is it enough? If you're talking about a $500,000 bill, maybe not. And so one way to pay for long-term care is to do a combination of these things. Now, the good news is, for folks who've been affiliated with the military, there are some military-friendly options to pay for long-term care. The VA does provide limited long-term care support, and it's a range of benefits and services, but it depends on your need, your financial situation, your VA disability status, and various other factors. The VA maintains a guide to long-term care on its website. It's well worth reading it to see what your options are. There's also a federal long-term care insurance program that's available to federal employees, and that includes active duty military and retirees. This program is underwritten, although the underwriting is abbreviated for active duty military. So what that means is you do have to pass their health tests for eligibility. But if you're eligible, this may be a good deal for you, particularly if you're on active duty, because while you're on active duty, You may also be able to enroll your spouse, your adult children, and your parents. Now, once you retire, only your current spouse remains eligible for going through the writing process and enrolling. So do be aware of that before you retire. But if you want to and are able to participate, this is a great way to cover some of your long-term care expenses. Now, again, it can be packaged. There are 4 packages there, or you can customize it. It does have an inflation protection option, and unlike some other options, it provides for both institutional and home care. So it's well worth looking into this program and learning more about it. Now, when you're talking about standard long-term care, again, every policy is unique, and it becomes important for you to shop around, ask questions, and that same thing is true for life insurance with a long-term care option. Make sure you look into and read carefully about what the policy provides, what kind of benefits you'll get. So, for instance, standard long-term care pays a daily benefit, and it ranges typically from $100 to $150 a day. For a specified benefit period, it can be for life or for a particular period of years. There's usually a maximum lifetime benefit, but these things can adjust, and they can be customized. There's normally some underwriting required. How much depends on the policy, but you need to be aware that just because one policy provides one thing, the next one might be something quite different. So with that, you want to plan ahead because age tends to increase the cost of premiums, and so can health issues. So you need to be aware of that and plan accordingly. Recognize that the cheapest policy may not be the best for you. You want it to come from a reliable insurance and to have some flexibility in it. There are several ways to reduce costs. One is to go for a shared care benefit with your spouse, where you buy a certain number of years of coverage, for example, and you use some and your spouse uses some, and together you probably have enough. You may want to have a longer elimination period. I mentioned earlier that typically there's a 30 to 90-day waiting period before long-term care benefits kick in. You may want to make yours a little longer. That's a way to have it be less expensive. There are various inflation protection options. You can have compound or simple, depending on where you are in your life and what other assets you have available. You may choose one or the other. You do need to read the fine print and consider the alternatives, but recognize that this can be a piece of your plan. It doesn't need to be all of it. Which leads to the most important point. The choice of how you're going to pay for your long-term care is a huge decision, and one size definitely does not fit all. So what you need to do is think carefully about all of the factors that we previously considered and how you want to spend the remainder of your life should you find yourself with a need for long-term care. It's important to educate yourself. This webinar is a starting point, but there's a lot of other information available that we'll discuss in a moment. So learn about that and look at the alternatives. Consider talking, not only thinking about it yourself, but talking with your spouse, talking with your family, the people who are likely to have to help you should you need long-term care, and put together a plan. Again, I can't emphasize enough, it's a good idea to consider blended care and to consider the likelihood that you will need long-term care more than once in your life. So you want to make sure that the coverage that you have, that the plan you have in place, will be sufficient to meet your needs on more than one occasion. If you never need it, that's great. But that way you won't find yourself in a situation where you need it and don't have it. It's worth speaking with your investment advisor to talk about your financial options and look at how your long-term care fits into your overall financial plan for your life. And then finally, you have to pick what's best for you. Think about your needs, your options, what's going to make the most sense, and plan accordingly. So this is not something anyone else can really do for you. It's a decision you pretty much have to make for yourself. Now here's a list of resources. These are several websites that I like a lot and that are very helpful as you're familiarizing yourself with your long-term care options. The federal website, longtermcare.gov, provides a lot of information, very worthwhile. The federal program for federal long-term care insurance has its own website. I mentioned the Veterans Administration's long-term care benefits site. AARP has wonderful information available. The National Care Planning Council has a lot, and so does Life Happens. And then I would recommend that you supplement all of these things with other resources that work for you. There's a lot out there. And there are also a lot of people who maintain private websites, people who can sell long-term care to you, people who like to advise. When you talk to those people, make sure you recognize that they are coming to you from a particular perspective, and take their advice with an appropriate grain of salt. You can also contact us. We are here to help you. Navy Mutual takes a lot of pride in providing education to our members. And so if you have questions about long-term care, about what we can do for you, how we can help you, please feel free to reach us here. And with that, I'm going to open this up for questions. And we've already received a couple in advance of the presentation. One of the questions that we got is, what happens if I buy my long-term care insurance and I don't use it? Which is a real good question, and it does happen sometimes. Long-term care insurance is typically like term insurance. You pay into it for a period of time, and if you don't use it before you pass away, then the money never is paid out or returned to you. This is why some people prefer to buy whole life insurance with a long-term care option, because that way, if you don't use it, that money is available to pay to your beneficiaries when you pass away. Another question that we received, can a family member get paid for giving me long-term care? And that's going to depend. It depends on the kind of care they're giving, whether they're working full-time or part-time, the terms of whatever coverage or whatever benefits that you've arranged to receive. So it's worth looking into that, particularly if you're in a situation where you expect to rely on a family member for some or all of your long-term care. As we discussed, there are situations where people either give up or lose jobs and benefits to provide long-term care to someone. And under those circumstances, it's very nice if they can get paid by whatever benefit program you have. The last question that we received is, are there medical conditions that could disqualify me? You'll remember that I mentioned that underwriting is typically part of long-term care insurance. And so, yes, there are conditions that can disqualify you for long-term care insurance. For one thing, if you're already using long-term care, that's something that a carrier is likely to consider. If you have AIDS or are HIV positive, that may disqualify you. Cognitive dysfunctions, like Alzheimer's disease, for example, are things that insurers will frequently look to and disqualify accordingly. If you have a progressive neurological condition like ALS or Parkinson's, that is something that can get you turned down. If you've had a recent stroke or if you've had metastasized cancer, then those are the kinds of things that can make an insurance carrier look at you twice. But before you just give up on it, look into your options. Talk to various insurance companies. Some people may, some carriers may, another may not. But don't give up on it, and again, consider your other alternatives. And we've gotten one other question, where can I buy long-term care insurance? There are various sources. Certainly you can speak to your life insurance company. If your life insurer doesn't provide long-term care, they may be able to make some suggestions. You can look online. There are a lot of carriers who make those products available online as an initial thing, at least. And you can also look to longtermcare.gov for a list of factors you want to consider before you invest in a long-term care insurance policy. Now, if you have any other questions, please feel free to send them to us at Navy Mutual. We're at presentations@navymutual.org. Thank you for your time, everyone, and have a pleasant evening.